All right, so welcome to Period 8 review. We're going to talk about post-World War II. So what happens here is after World War II, we obviously are pretty aware, hopefully, that the Cold War is now set to begin. Now, the differences between post-World War I and post-World War II is that after World War II, we are never going back to being isolated, at least till modern day. We are not going to be neutral in world affairs. We're going to take an active role. So the United States didn't join the League of Nations after World War I. Well, the United Nations is now created after World War II, and the United States is going to join. Um, Now, as far as similarities between Woodrow Wilson's 14 points at the end of World War I and the Atlantic Charter during World War II, I always said Woodrow Wilson is kind of like a person or a man ahead of his time because he had these 14 points where these idealistic views of everybody having self-determination, the League of Nations, etc. But we didn't listen to it, okay? We reject it. The Atlantic Charter kind of brings up a lot of those points, okay? And the Atlantic Charter is between Winston Churchill and FDR, so America and England, in which they pledge, hey, listen, this post-war world is going to be one in which we'd like to see democracy, we'd like to see self-determination of countries, there should be no countries colonizing, etc. So again, we should have listened to Woodrow Wilson the first time because after World War II, we definitely listened to some of his ideas. Now, the Cold War is between the United States and the Soviet Union, and although it's not a direct military engagement, there are going to be several little battles or wars within it, because ultimately the Cold War is a political, economic, and ideological battle between us and the Soviets. So speaking about some of those wars that are in the Cold War itself, remember the biggest term we get from the Cold War is the idea of containment. Now, the word containment should ring a bell. What are we trying to do? What's our goal in the Cold War? To contain the spread of communism. We don't want it to spread anywhere else. Two major conflicts that pop up because of containment. We have the Korean War. So if you remember, the Korean War really is all about the fight for communism to stay put in North Korea. So Korea, once upon a time in 1910, was colonized by the Japanese. After World War II is over, we decided to split Korea in half because there were communists there. The communists went to the north, and the nationalists, or those that support democracy, went to the south. We divided it at the 38th parallel, and a couple years after World War II is over, North Korea says we want to reunite our country as a communist country, and so they invade South Korea. Now, South Korea asks the United Nations to help them out, and the United Nations says yes. The guy that's going to be in command of the coalition forces, coalition means many different countries together, we put the guy General Douglas MacArthur in charge. Now, you may recognize his name from World War II because he fought against the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. Nonetheless, he comes in, he saves the day, but then China starts to help out North Korea, and Douglas MacArthur says, you know what, let's make sure China doesn't have a larger role, so let's just drop a nuke on them. Well, that's not a good idea, MacArthur, because if we drop a nuke on them, well, that could bring in the Soviet Union, and we don't want that, okay? And so the Soviets, by this time, do have their own nuclear bombs, and that would widen the war. Truman fires MacArthur, and that's the end of that. Now, the war does come to an end in what we call a ceasefire. Ceasefire means they stop shooting at each other, and to this day, North and South Korea are still divided at the 38th parallel. So was containment successful? Yes. Very similar story with Vietnam. After World War II, the Japanese are forced to leave, and Vietnam still has communists in it, just like Korea. So we split the country in half. North Vietnam goes to the communists, and South Vietnam goes to the nationalists. Now, under the Eisenhower and JFK administrations, they each sent quote-unquote military advisors to Vietnam to make sure that communism did not spread, but it's not until Lyndon Johnson's presidency that the war does expand. Now, Lyndon Johnson, with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, we find out that we are being shot at in the Gulf of Tonkin. Meanwhile, it was just a thunderstorm. And Congress says we can't have this happen, and they actually do a huge mistake, and they give what we call, as a metaphor, a blank check to Lyndon Johnson, meaning they give him all power concerning the Vietnam War. That was a no-no. He is going to start bombing the hell out of Vietnam, trying to get them to submit. For 4 years, he tells Americans the war is going well, this thing's going to end soon. And then all of a sudden in 1968, the Tet Offensive happens, where simultaneously all of our military bases are attacked in South Vietnam, which is a huge shock to Americans who thought the war was going well. That means Lyndon Johnson is lying. That means we have to get him out. He's not going to be reelected. He steps down, and Richard Nixon will be the next president who says, vote for me, and I will take us out of Vietnam. So, he eventually will, although Nixon is not really remembered for that. He's more remembered for his domestic follies, okay, with Watergate. But nonetheless, that's the Vietnam War, okay, very controversial, very unique time period in U.S. history. Indirect military conflicts, in the middle of the screen there, we see the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Both of their goals is to give money to countries to help prevent the spread of communism. As far as China, we know China is going to fall to communism by 1949. That civil war between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, okay, winds up going to Mao Zedong, and Truman is blamed for, quote-unquote, losing China. Not his fault. As far as alliances that we enter into, we already talked about the UN and also NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a defensive military alliance where if one of those countries is attacked, the others are supposed to have their back, still around today. The CIA is formed after World War II, and they're going to be involved in setting up secret operations in countries like Iran, Guatemala, Cuba to overthrow leaders and replace them with other dictators, which will be, as we know, huge mistakes in places like Iran and Cuba, because just because they're pro-democracy or pro-US doesn't mean that a dictator is a good person. Awesome. We'll talk more about it. Nixon Doctrine just refers to the idea, just like he did in Vietnam with Vietnamization, we're going to withdraw troops and give the fight back to the people of not only Vietnam, but other countries in Asia as well. Military buildups. The arms race is all about the United States and the Soviet Union building up their nuclear weapons. Okay, this is going to dramatically increase with a report by the National Security Council in NCS 68, okay, under the Truman administration. Eisenhower kind of calls this into question with his farewell address and says maybe we shouldn't do this, maybe we shouldn't be focused on the military-industrial complex, which is ironic because Eisenhower is a military man himself. There's always the growing threat of retaliation, meaning any moment one of the countries could set off a nuclear bomb and the others would retaliate, and it would lead to global nuclear warfare, which means we all die. JFK, flexible response, he basically says, listen, we shouldn't always just be quick to say we're going to nuke people. Let's have other responses besides just nuking each other. Okay, good. The space race. Sputnik is launched by the Soviets in 1957. That's a huge blow to America, who always thought we were going to be number one in everything. That causes us to create things like NASA and the National Defense Education Act, which we give more money to science and math programs. JFK does say we are going to be the first to put a man on the moon, and we will by 1969. Unfortunately, JFK is not around because his brains were killed or splat out. Okay, détente is another term you should really know, again from last year as well. Détente means the relaxation of Cold War tensions. There are numerous examples of this throughout the Cold War during numerous presidents' administrations. Most of us associate with Nixon's administration, but there are other presidents as well. The first major thaw in the Cold War comes during the Eisenhower years, during Khrushchev and Eisenhower meeting at Geneva to what they call for an atoms for peace plan, where they both agree to limit the arms race and to stop competing with each other. That all goes out the window when we are caught spying on the Soviets with our U-2 plane incident. They shoot down our plane, and we have to admit we were spying on them. Awesome, great. There goes that. Fast forward to JFK's presidency, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a huge debacle for us because we put Fidel Castro in power. We now have an issue where he is going to run to the Soviets for security. They put missiles on Cuba, and for 13 days, the world was on edge. What was going to happen with the missiles? Are they going to shoot them at us? Because if they do, we don't have much time to evacuate major cities like New York and Washington, D.C., or Miami, or Chicago, or St. Louis, etc. Nonetheless, JFK handles this perfectly. He blockades Cuba, and the Soviet Union backs down. They call us up. They come to a compromise. The compromise is if they remove their missiles from Cuba, we will remove our missiles from Turkey. And one of the results, which was also an example of détente, is that we're going to install a direct hotline between us and Moscow, which is very good. Nixon, as I said, he is really going to lessen the Cold War tensions between us and the Soviets. He is going to be the first U.S. president to travel to communist China. He takes advantage of what we call the Sino-Soviet split, where the Soviet Union and the Chinese realize they have a lot of differences. Just because they're both communists doesn't mean they have the same brand of communism, so they split, and Nixon takes advantage of that, which means tensions with China are going down. Awesome. Nixon also signs the SALT Treaty, which was the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, and that basically means us and the Soviet Union are going to limit the amount of nuclear missiles we're going to build. That's great. That's an example of détente. Problem was, it was only for 5 years. 5 years down the road, they want to re-up it in the SALT II Treaty. We turn it down because Jimmy Carter says, I don't approve of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And instead of signing the SALT II Treaty, we give money and weapons to the people that are leading the fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan, led by a guy named Osama bin Laden. He comes back to bite us too. A lot of the stuff already talked about, okay, as far as Eisenhower and his military-industrial complex warning us that we're going down a bad road. We talked about the SALT Treaty. We talked about Truman firing MacArthur, Gulf of Tonkin, and Vietnam. One of the lessons learned from Vietnam is that we create the War Powers Act in 1973, which says we are going to limit the power of the president. They can't send troops overseas for longer than 60 days without congressional approval. If Congress doesn't approve, those troops must come home. Next side, the Korean War. Obviously, we talked about that as well. We talked about how the Vietnam War was very polarizing, how there was two sides, people that really were for the war. We call them war hawks. People that are doves or people that are against the war. A lot of doves out there, a lot of famous people being against the war, civil rights activists, okay, celebrities, etc. But a very unique and different time of U.S. history is Vietnam, okay? And so be aware of how polarizing, how unique this era is. Okay, the Cold War at home, be aware of this, the second Red Scare. We have a lot of people who are scared of communists, okay, once again, just like the 1920s. To heighten this hysteria, there were actual people that were found to be communists, like Alger Hiss, who was a advisor once upon a time to FDR. The Rosenbergs were a couple, an American couple, that were actually Soviet spies. We find out that they were living a double life, if you will. So not all the hysteria was fake. The hysteria that was fake was really hyped up by McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy. He's a senator who claims to have a list of 205 people in our government who are communists. Well, he is a politician who wants to get reelected, so he wants people to reelect him, and so he claims to have this list. Okay, he really heightens the second Red Scare. As a response to the McCarthy era, we do have a federal employee loyalty program where now we background check people who work for the government. Probably a good idea anyway. The House of Un-American Activities Committee, the most silly sounding name of a committee ever. They are in charge of investigating whether or not people are communists or not. Again, a lot of people weren't communists. They just were accused. Richard Nixon makes a name for himself as a lawyer here in California for this committee, and obviously goes on to become vice president and then president. Both Democrats and Republicans, though, partake in the Second Red Scare. After World War II, okay, we see what we call decolonization, which means the United States and the Soviet Union and all the other countries, although they are decolonizing or taking away colonies from other countries, it doesn't mean that colonization is really over. We're now fighting for influence in these places because they're like little pawns to the United States and the Soviet Union, where we're using them to be our friend. And if they're our friend, they're not our friend of the the enemy, and vice versa. A couple issues in the Middle East. We have some CIA operations here, like Operation Ajax, where Eisenhower is going to use the CIA to infiltrate and overthrow governments, like I said before, in Iran. We're going to overturn the dictator in Iran and put the Shah in power, which is going to in turn be a very bad idea because Jimmy Carter is going to have the hostage crisis that has to do with the Shah later on. What else in the Middle East? Egypt says we want our Suez Canal back. They nationalize it, and England and France and Israel are going to attack Egypt. The United States is a little upset because they didn't ask us to help out. Oh, sad face emoji. Eisenhower, also with his Eisenhower Doctrine, remember, all has to do with the Middle East. As far as OPEC, OPEC is still around today. They control oil, and the major countries in the Middle East that control that oil, they control prices, things like that. They still affect us to this day. As far as OPEC, they are going to place an embargo on the United States for oil, which is going to hurt us big time. Prices are going to increase, and that's going to hurt our economy big time in the late 1970s. Again, that's something Jimmy Carter is going to have to deal with in his presidency and doesn't set him up for success. Speaking of Jimmy Carter, there is one major success of his presidency called the Camp David Accords, in which he does get Egypt and Israel to sit down and acknowledge each other. That's a huge win because Egypt is predominantly Muslim and Israel is a Jewish country. They did not acknowledge each other before this point, and being the first Arab country to acknowledge Israel is a big deal. So that's a big win for Jimmy Carter. Finishing up or wrapping up the Latin American stuff, we talked about Guatemala and the CIA overthrowing and putting a new dictator in power. We did the same thing with Fidel Castro in Cuba. We overthrew Batista, put Castro in power. As far as realizing Castro was a bad egg, we tried to come up with an operation to overthrow him in what's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Eisenhower and the CIA will train Cuban exiles to infiltrate Cuba and overthrow him. Goes horribly wrong, and because Eisenhower is no longer president, people don't blame him, they blame JFK for the failure. Castro is really upset that they try to overthrow him, obviously, so he goes running to the Soviets. He says, I need some security, and the Soviets said, we got you, let's put missiles on Cuba, which now sets up our Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so the rise of liberalism, let me, before I even talk about what a liberal is, I just want to make sure you have an understanding of what a liberal and a conservative is. A liberal is typically a politician or a person that supports social welfare programs, government assistance. Typically, those are going to be Democrats. FDR, Lyndon Johnson, Teddy Roosevelt, those are liberals. Now, conservatives, those are going to be typically Republicans. They're typically less government spending, less government involvement, sometimes laissez-faire approaches, pro-business. Those are going to be your Ronald Reagans, your Herbert Hoover, okay, your Gilded Age presidents, for example. Okay, those would be conservatives. So, back to this, okay? The rise of liberalism in the post-war world, we see a couple liberal presidents. We have FDR, we have Truman, we have Lyndon Johnson, where you're going to see a shift of helping people through social welfare programs, right? The New Deal in period 7, we talk about how they help. Lyndon Johnson considers himself an extension of the New Deal, and you're going to see him create programs like the Head Start program to help preschool, to get kids, into schooling earlier. Job Corps he creates, in which creates vocational education. Okay, vocational jobs are jobs for like carpenters or mechanics, things like that. Medicare and Medicaid, okay, we care for our elderly, so medical care for the elderly is Medicare. Medicaid is medical assistance for the poor or disabled. Now, also, a lot of the times liberals are pro-immigration, and Lyndon Johnson reverses the immigration quotas that we had since the 1920s. He opens the door for immigrants in the 1960s. And you're going to see a couple of court cases that kind of reflect this pro-liberal thinking. You do not have to know these cases. They're just worth mentioning. If you take next year politics, you'll know more about these cases. But East versus United States protects your First Amendment rights. Okay. Griswold versus Connecticut, where the people, us citizens, have the right to privacy, and birth control cannot be prohibited. Okay. And that birth control is a big one because that's going against fundamentalist values or beliefs. That's controversial. Miranda versus Arizona, this is your Fifth Amendment right, that you have the right to be told why you're being arrested, and a cop has to tell you while they're arresting you. Okay, again, all liberal ideas. Don't have to know them, but just worth mentioning. You're going to see this shift, okay, back and forth throughout history, from liberals to conservatives, from conservatives to liberals. Depends on the circumstances. People get fed up with liberals and they go conservative for a couple of years. They get fed up with the conservatives. We go back to the liberals, the left, and so on and so forth. Okay, but just be aware of what a liberal and a conservative is. Criticisms for both the left and the right. The left is a liberal, by the way. The right are conservatives. The criticisms for liberals is that not enough was being done for civil rights, okay, that all of the civil rights movements and the laws, the legislation we get in the 1960s, like the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, wasn't radical enough, because obviously we still have issues today with civil rights. Another criticism was the handling of the Vietnam War by Lyndon Johnson. Okay, the horrible things that occurred, like My Lai, the lying to the people with the Tet Offensive, the expanding the war into Cambodia. Okay, those are some arguments as well against liberals. You see students become very vocal during this time period. Students, protesting, usually peaceful protests, all saying that the government is either lying or should not be involved in Vietnam or should be doing more for civil rights. Criticisms from the right, okay, that's your conservatives, your Republicans. We see the Republicans, not really have the White House from a long time. Really, during the 20th century, we only see the Republicans, the conservatives, having office during Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft. We see the 1920s, and then after the 1920s, we have a long time of Teddy Roosevelt. We have Truman. Then Eisenhower comes in. But Eisenhower, surprisingly, isn't a typical conservative because he does not break down a lot of those New Deal programs, and he even has his own public works project with the building of the interstate highway system. 64, they lose again to Lyndon Johnson, okay, with Barry Goldwater, but as we know, Lyndon Johnson's going to drive the liberals into the ground with his handling of Vietnam. So in comes Nixon. And Nixon, okay, is going to have a lot of scandals and a lot of arguments as to why we need to get rid of him because of Watergate and lying to the government and to the people about the expansion of the war in Vietnam by bombing Laos and Cambodia. So it's just a mess, all right? And politics are a mess, okay? I'm not going to lie. They're a mess. We go back and forth and vice versa. 1980, Ronald Reagan comes in, saves the day for the conservatives. With his Reaganomics, turns the economy around. The 1980s are an economically pretty good time in America. And during this conservative era in the 1980s, you see more Christian fundamentalist beliefs as well, where we don't like to mess with things like, birth control or a woman's right to an abortion, things like that. So conservatives are typically fundamentalists as well. Okay, all three branches of government have helped advance civil rights and extend greater racial justice. We've seen the executive branch. The executive member is the presidency. From Truman, desegregating the armed forces, okay, to presidents like Lyndon Johnson actually signing into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The judicial branch plays a huge role. The biggest case to take from them is them overturning Plessy versus Ferguson with Brown versus the Board of Ed to integrate schools. That's big. Congress ultimately, I think, in my opinion, has the greatest say in civil rights because they're the ones that write laws, remember, right? And so the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ends segregation, is a huge one. The Voting Rights Act in 1965, which ends literacy tests, and the 24th Amendment ends poll taxes. Those are all huge. So I would definitely know those and be aware that of their importance, that all three branches played a role. Civil rights. Civil rights is a jam-packed unit within, period 8. We see a lot of civil rights movements. We see the Double V campaign, which you remember or should remember is that African Americans fought for freedom overseas during World War II, but also here at home for equality. We saw CORE, we saw the NAACP, their membership increases. There's a lot of challenges and people to know. People like Thurgood Marshall, who is a lawyer during the Brown versus the Board of Ed case, who becomes the first Supreme Court justice who is African American. We see people like Rosa Parks cause the Montgomery bus boycott. We know who Rosa Parks is. We know her story, but because of her and her incident, this causes a boycott of the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. We see students once again getting involved in Greensboro, where they are going to perform sit-ins, which remember is a peaceful protest. Freedom riders are people that ride into the South trying to promote people to, or African Americans specifically, to register to vote because we did see a decline of that. This is all part of that Freedom Summer where the goal was to raise awareness for that lack of voter registration. These are various grassroots movements, meaning they're homegrown, they're from people, they're not, fabricated by any means. Now, as far as the slow pace to desegregate, obviously the South is not going to like all this extension of civil rights. You're going to see a bunch of senators and congressmen sign the Southern Manifesto, which is them basically ignoring and refusing to accept the Brown versus the Board of Ed decision. Eisenhower is going to have to get involved with Little Rock and Arkansas, the 9 African American students who were barred from going to school by the governor, Oral Favis, love his name. But nonetheless, okay, the troops escort them to school. Through all this peaceful protest that we just mentioned, we're also going to see some violent protests as well. And definitely know 2 guys, okay, that are from the civil rights movement in Martin Luther King Jr., civil disobedience, peaceful protest, unfortunately assassinated, and Malcolm X, who is by any means necessary. Peaceful, peaceful, violent, violent, okay? It is what it is. They both have the same goal, just different means of getting to that goal. Okay, so speaking of violent protests, we have a couple of good examples. The Watt riots break out in 1965 after a black motorist is pulled over and beaten by white police officers. Sadly enough, we've seen instances of this in modern history in the last few years. So this stuff still happens. Next, we see the Black Panthers. Okay, remember Black Panthers are a militant African American group formed by Huey Newton, Bobby Seale. They're not the same as Malcolm X, so just be careful. Malcolm X is a completely separate person who is not associated with the Black Panthers. As previously mentioned, Malcolm X is by any means necessary. However, to get equality is the answer. Okay, he is a member of the Nation of Islam, the Black Muslims, if you will, and the big word or term to know from him is Black separatism. All right, so we get that idea of black separatism, Malcolm X, all the way from the 1920s when we talk about Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey gets that idea all the way back to the James Monroe era, where they create the American Colonization Society in Africa or Liberia. Henry Clay and James Monroe created a place for former slaves to go back to, but it was unsuccessful because, if you remember, they were so far removed from their culture. Other civil rights movements, women's rights, yes, they already have the right to vote, but the women's role in society is still a struggle. The 1950s seem to have taken a step back in women's role, which was reinforced by TV shows during that time. Women's, role in society was kind of go back home and raise the children, which was interesting. But Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique, her book, is going to challenge that traditional role and say, what are we doing here? Shouldn't we be out in the workforce and going to get it? Title IX is something significant for women. Okay, 1972, Title IX ends sex discriminations in schools. One of the things that Title IX still does or has an effect in schools today is saying that all schools, colleges, high schools, middle schools, etc., have to have an equal number of boy and girls sports. Equal Rights Amendment, unfortunately, will fall short, but would have given equal rights, in many different areas in our country to both men and women. Roe versus Wade was a Supreme Court case that allowed women to have the choice in an abortion. Doesn't allow the government to have a say. This is still contested to this day. It's still brought up in presidential elections, for example, so it's still something that's relevant today. Other minority groups, the American Indians in 1968, fighting for their culture, their people, the Native Americans, as we know, just the sad history. And still, American Indians are still amongst the poorest of Americans to this day. Cesar Chavez, and our United Farm Workers fighting for the workers of our Latino farm workers here in America, and is going to bring a lot of awareness to that movement. We talked about the Immigration Act opening the doors for immigrants, and the Stonewall riots, that leads to the modern day gay rights movement, the LGBTQ movement. Society and economics from 1950 to 1980. Ooh, that's a nutshell there. There's a lot going on there. We see the rise of the middle class during the 1950s, increased social mobility, so going all over the place from working class to middle class, etc. We know after World War II, people moved to those Levittowns, the suburbs, create the baby boom generation. The Cold War, we see a lot of defense spending, which means a lot of jobs are to be had in the Sun Belt region. That's in the southern western part of the United States. Television, big invention really from the 1920s, but becomes more common in the 1950s in people's homes, reinforces the social norms of the day, etc. Counterculture of the 1950s are the Beats, rock and roll, etc. The 1960s counterculture group is the hippies. More of us know that, where they're all about, sexual revolutions against, the war in Vietnam, things like that. Challenges, against religion. We see fundamentalist beliefs being challenged, by your more vocal people like hippies, for example. All right, going against that conservative fundamentalist ideas. All right, and that is it. That's all I have for you in period 8. That's a lot of information, I know. Good news is, though, you do have a lot of contextual information from last year. Hopefully this helps. If you think it helps, give it a like or subscribe. Until next time, peace out.